So I read what I thought was an interesting story about this guy who, in his younger days, he actually got a job as a professor, but then he has kind of this religious encounter with Christ. He was religious before, but this kind of major encounter with Christ. And he decides to change his life because of it. And he wants to spend his life after this just loving people. So it sounds strange. He actually took a job as a mailman. And so his friend says, tries to talk him out of it, that you had this job as a professor, you got all this education, why waste it as a mailman? And he said, no, I just believe this is what Christ wants me to do. I'm supposed to spend my life loving people. Now, I know that part because I saw people's eyebrows. How do you know a mailman is not called? All these postal workers, sometimes they just are called to a life of love. And so he's trying to talk him out of being a mailman, and finally his friend gives up and says, well, I know that if you're going to be a mailman, you'll be the best one. And he says, no, really, I'm not the best one. I'm always the last on my route. And he says, well, why are you last on your route? And he says, because I do spend time talking to all the neighbors. And a lot of my people, they're lonely and they need connection. And so I'll talk to them. So he's kind of surprised by that, but he really felt that his calling was to show love to everybody on his route. And this is the amazing part. After a couple years as a mailman, it was his birthday, and the people on his route rented out a gym to throw his birthday party because he had touched their lives, which I really love. But I love the fact that that encounter with Christ called him to be this source where he wanted to see Christ in everybody. He wanted to be the presence of Christ to everybody on his route. And I mention that because, if you look for evidence of the resurrection, I think the best place to look for evidence of the resurrection is actually in the lives of other people. He had this encounter of Christ. Then he wants to be Christ for other people. He wants to see Christ in other people. That's the evidence. The same way if I said, this sounds strange. My analogy would be this. I don't know how a television works. I really don't. All I know is how to turn it on and change the channels. But I have evidence that it does work because I'm watching it. I don't know how a car works. I can barely drive. Seriously, I'm not even a good driver. I'm really not. It's a small story. I was teaching at St. Ignatius, and one kid, this happened a couple years ago, raised his hand. So, I used to think I'm hitting out of the ballpark. Now I know. So I said, well, yeah, can I help you? And he says, yeah, my dad and I saw you driving. You're a bad driver. Yeah, I know. My point being is that I couldn't really even tell you how a car works. You need a computer degree now. But I can technically drive a car. That's my evidence. I can't tell you how the resurrection works, but I know it because of its effects. The same way I can see the TV, I can see a car run. I can see the effect of the resurrection in people like the mailman who want to spend his life loving other people. That's evidence. What the resurrection is Christ. It's not the same life. The mailman, after he has this encounter with Christ, his life is not the same. He doesn't want to be a professor. He wants to spend it really loving other people. The resurrection in us changes our lives, changes the way we see everything. And so I thought of this analogy of the resurrection. So just bear with it. It's a strange analogy, as everything is with me. But so I've heard people describe Alzheimer's, if your spouse has Alzheimer's. This one guy said, his wife had Alzheimer's. And, he could see the light slowly go out of her eyes, that she couldn't quite recognize their grandchildren or children. And eventually he said, she couldn't recognize me. And the light just kept going out until when she'd see him, there'd be no recognition. And I thought, that's a great example of the reverse of the resurrection, where the resurrection, us, is kind of the reverse of Alzheimer. We start to recognize each other differently. I start to see the light in you and the light in the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist. I can hear the gospel. You start to wake up to the presence of Christ all around you. Does that analogy make sense? It's us awakening to the presence of Christ all around us. And so the resurrection is a whole new way when it happens inside of us. When Christ is resurrected in us, we see the world completely differently. Now, I have to admit, I was a little defensive this week because I do this obnoxious thing of reading these memes that people have against Christianity. So one this week was about Easter, where some atheists were saying, oh, the Christians are celebrating zombie Jesus. And it said, well, there's other religions that celebrate the resurrection, such as the Egyptians celebrated Orion, not Orion. Oh, gosh, I forgot his name. Starts with an O. An Egyptian god who was resurrected, but technically he wasn't resurrected. He died. Somebody sewed his body back together, so he was kind of like this weird Frankenstein existence. That's resuscitation. And I really don't like mocking Christianity because this is the same group. If you mixed up the word Asian and Oriental, they would accuse you of being insensitive. And yet, you're fully free to mock other people's belief if it's Christianity. And Christianity, it doesn't celebrate that Jesus came back to life. It celebrates that Jesus is life. The resurrection is not coming back. The resurrection is a whole new life. And if Christ is resurrected in us, then yes, we have a whole new life of seeing the world differently. We see everything differently. So I mentioned that, just the idea of seeing everything differently, because that's what's going on in the readings. Where in the gospel, it's the road to Emmaus. And just a little background on the road to Emmaus. 2 disciples are running away from Jerusalem. They are scared. They're scared for their lives. They're running away, and this stranger starts to walk with them. And the stranger is Christ. But because of their fear and their head in the wrong direction, they can't recognize the presence of Christ. And then they say, and I love this, they say, are you the only one who doesn't know what's going on in Jerusalem? And then they told him about Christ. Well, they have that memorized. And then the stranger, Christ, starts to explain that, no, the Messiah had to come, die, and be resurrected. So that's odd. They know the story, but that's the first time they realized what the story means. And then, if you notice, they notice them their eyes are open in the breaking of the bread. That's the Eucharist. That's the same parts that we have at Mass. The procession in is a journey. The gospel, same as Christ explaining Scripture, and the breaking of the bread is a Eucharist. And when their eyes are open, suddenly they recognize, it's Christ. And they turn around, they change the direction of their life, and they run back into the danger, Jerusalem. Except this time they're not afraid, they're joyous. And they break into where the apostles are. It's Sunday, they're celebrating Mass. They break in and they say, we've seen him. And Christ appears. And he's not like a philosophical idea. He's actually flesh and blood. And yet, he can walk through doors. But the idea there is that he is completely real and present. And what you notice is that their whole life changes. Now, instead of being frightened based on fear, actually, they're joyous. They actually go out and start preaching. Their whole life is turned around because now their eyes are open. And the whole point of that is that, the resurrection, Christ living inside us, is supposed to slowly change our lives where we see everything differently. Instead of you just being a stranger, no, you're Christ. The Bible Um, like that, this part amazed me. They had the Bible memorized, but they could never hear what it meant until the resurrection. Because a lot of people think, well, you just have to study the Bible, have it memorized, and you'll know Jesus. That's not true. If you memorize the Bible, what you have is you have memorized the Bible. It's in the resurrection where you understand what it means. Well, when the resurrection is in us, then we can hear the meaning. Before that, they could just quote the Bible. And what I like about that is that the Bible doesn't explain the resurrection. It's actually the opposite. The resurrection explains the rest of the Bible. The whole way you understand things is differently. Or just one more story. I just think you can't understand Christ if you're based on fear or ego or pride. The disciples running away, they couldn't recognize the presence of Christ in Scripture or in the stranger because of their fear. I think ego does the same thing. And this is a story. So, true story, this young man gets on a train. He's in France, gets on a train, and the old man sitting across from him is reading the Bible. And the young man says, "You don't believe in what you're reading, do you?" And he says, "Yes, I do." And he says, I don't. He says, "I'm a scientist. I think logically." And, the old man is very nice to him. And the young man is getting off the train, so he just wants to be polite and introduces himself and says, "What is your name?" And he says, "Pasteur, Louis Pasteur." One of the greatest scientists of the century. The only difference is Louis tells that because if you're not careful, you may be smart, but pride blinds you. Ego blinds you. And I think the same point. The disciples, they're heading the wrong direction. They're filled with fear. They can't see the presence of Christ. You're filled with too much ego. It blinds you. And what I like is at this Easter time, what we're praying for is the same conversion that happened to that mailman. That we have this encounter with Christ that year after year when we celebrate Easter, our eyes are opened a little bit more. That we can see the presence of Christ in each other. We can finally understand, oh, that's what the Bible means. Or in the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist, our eyes are truly open to see the presence of Christ all around us. And then, like the guy who became the mailman, we realize our job in life is to make sure everybody feels loved. He had his vocation once he encountered Christ. For us, when we celebrate the resurrection, I hope our eyes and ears are open to find Christ in a million ways. And so, together, let us stand